Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Samantha, and joining me today is Michael.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic, which is a fascinating Supreme Court case from 1970 that had major implications for India's former princely rulers.
That's right, Michael. Today we'll be discussing the case of Maharajadhiraja Madhav Rao, Jiwaji Rao, Scindia Bahadur vs. Union of India. It's quite a mouthful, but this case dealt with some really interesting constitutional questions about the rights and privileges of India's former rulers after independence.
To set the stage for our listeners, can you give us a quick overview of the historical context here? What was the situation with India's princely states at the time of independence in 1947?
Absolutely. So at the time of Indian independence in 1947, there were over 500 princely states that were technically independent but had been under British paramountcy. When the British left, these states had to decide whether to join India, join Pakistan, or try to remain independent.
And what happened with most of these states?
Through a process of negotiation led by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, almost all of the states agreed to accede to India. They signed instruments of accession, giving control of defense, foreign affairs, and communications to the Indian government. Many then signed merger agreements, fully integrating with India.
So the rulers gave up their sovereign powers. But what did they get in return?
As part of these agreements, the rulers were guaranteed certain rights and privileges. This included annual payments called privy purses, as well as certain personal privileges, titles, and exemptions from taxes and legal proceedings. These were seen as compensation for the rulers giving up their powers and territories.
And these guarantees were actually written into the Indian Constitution when it was adopted in 1950, right?
That's correct. Articles 291, 362, and 366(22) of the Constitution dealt with the privy purses, recognition of rulers, and their privileges. The idea was to honor the agreements made during the integration process.
So what led to this Supreme Court case in 1970? What changed?
Well, by 1970, there was growing political sentiment that these special privileges for former rulers were outdated and incompatible with ideas of equality and democracy. The government tried to pass a constitutional amendment to abolish the privy purses and privileges, but it failed to get the required majority in the upper house of Parliament.
And that's when they tried a different approach.
Exactly. Just hours after the amendment failed, President V.V. Giri signed an order withdrawing recognition of all the rulers. The government's argument was that without official recognition under Article 366(22), the former rulers would no longer be entitled to privy purses or special privileges.
That seems like quite a drastic move. How did the rulers respond?
Several of the former rulers, led by the Maharaja of Gwalior, filed petitions in the Supreme Court challenging the president's order. They argued it was unconstitutional and violated their fundamental rights.
This case really gets to the heart of some fascinating constitutional issues. What were the main arguments on each side?
The petitioners, the former rulers, made several key arguments. They said the president didn't have the power to wholesale derecognize all rulers. They argued this violated the constitutional guarantees in Articles 291 and 362. They also claimed it infringed on their fundamental rights to property under Articles 19 and 31.
And what was the government's defense?
The government argued that recognizing rulers was a political act, part of the concept of paramountcy inherited from the British. They said Article 363 of the Constitution barred courts from interfering in disputes relating to these ruler agreements. They also argued the rulers' rights were imperfect rights that weren't legally enforceable.
That's quite a complex set of arguments on both sides. How did the Supreme Court ultimately rule?
In a split decision, the majority of the court ruled in favor of the rulers. They held that the president's order was unconstitutional and invalid. The majority opinion, written by Justice J.C. Shah, made several important points.
Can you break down some of the key aspects of the majority opinion for us?
Certainly. First, they rejected the idea that recognizing rulers was a political act outside the court's jurisdiction. They said the president's power under Article 366(22) was a constitutional power that had to be exercised in accordance with the Constitution.
That makes sense. It puts limits on executive power.
Exactly. They also held that Article 291, which dealt with privy purses, created a legally enforceable right. It wasn't just a political obligation, but a constitutional mandate to make these payments.
That's interesting. So they saw it as more than just honoring a political agreement.
Yes, they viewed it as a constitutional guarantee. Another key point was their interpretation of Article 363, which bars court jurisdiction in certain disputes relating to these ruler agreements. The majority said this didn't apply to a dispute about the president's power to derecognize all rulers, which they saw as a constitutional question.
It sounds like they took a pretty narrow view of that jurisdictional bar.
They did. They essentially said Article 363 doesn't prevent the court from interpreting the relevant constitutional provisions. They also held that the ruler's right to privy purses was a property right protected under fundamental rights.
So in the end, they saw this as an overreach of executive power that violated constitutional rights.
That's a good summary. They viewed the wholesale derecognition as an attempt to do indirectly what Parliament had failed to do directly through constitutional amendment. They saw it as inconsistent with the constitutional scheme.
Were there any dissenting opinions in the case?
Yes, there were two dissenting opinions. Justice G.K. Mitter and Justice A.N. Ray both wrote dissents, arguing that Article 363 barred the court's jurisdiction in this matter. They took a broader view of what constituted a dispute relating to the ruler agreements.
This case really highlights some fascinating tensions in constitutional interpretation, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the idea of honoring agreements made during a critical transition in India's history. On the other, you have changing social and political values about equality and privilege.
Absolutely. It touches on so many important constitutional principles: separation of powers, limits on executive authority, interpretation of fundamental rights, the court's role in constitutional interpretation. It's a great case study in how these principles get applied in practice.
And it had real practical implications, too. What happened after this ruling?
Well, the immediate effect was that the privy purses and privileges were restored. However, the political momentum to abolish them continued. In 1971, the government was able to pass a constitutional amendment that finally abolished the privy purses and officially ended recognition of the rulers.
So in a way, this case just delayed that outcome rather than preventing it entirely.
That's right. But the case is still significant for the constitutional principles it established, particularly about limits on executive power and the court's role in interpreting the Constitution.
It's fascinating how these legal and constitutional issues intersect with the broader sweep of history. This case is really about India grappling with its monarchical past as it developed as a modern democracy.
Absolutely. It's a great example of how constitutional law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply connected to political, social, and historical forces. This case was part of India's ongoing process of defining itself as an independent nation and working out the practical and legal implications of that transition.
Are there any modern parallels or lessons we can draw from this case?
I think there are several. One is the ongoing tension in many countries between traditional institutions or privileges and modern democratic values. We see this debate play out in various forms around the world.
That's a good point. And I suppose it also speaks to the challenges of honoring historical agreements or treaties in changing times.
Definitely. It also highlights the important role of courts in mediating between different branches of government and interpreting the Constitution. The way the court navigated between executive power, legislative intent, and constitutional rights is quite instructive.
This has been such a fascinating discussion, Michael. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this complex case. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is the importance of understanding these constitutional cases in their full historical and political context. This wasn't just a dry legal dispute, it was part of India's ongoing journey of nation-building and constitutional development. It's a great reminder of how law and history intersect.
Thank you, Samantha, for sharing your insights on this landmark case. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Until next time.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time for more fascinating legal discussions.